There is a moment buried in the field notes of a man who spent his life listening to people the government had already decided were vanishing. An old Choctaw man was asked who had raised the great earthen hills that stood out of the Mississippi bottomland, the flat-topped platforms and the long ridges and the conical mounds that a farmer could plough around for a lifetime, that his fathers had found them already standing. And the old man answered, without any hesitation at all, the people who moved that his fathers had found them already standing, were in the country before the Choctaw came into it. The people who moved that carried their names anymore. Were in the country. The man writing those words down was James Mooney, and no one living carried their names or a showman or a preacher. The man writing those words down was James Mooney, and he was not a treasure hunter or a showman or a preacher with a theory to sell. He was an ethnologist. He was an ethnologist in a cabin for weeks, the kind who sat and wrote what he was told rather than what he was told. He worked for the Bureau of American Ethnology. He worked for the Bureau of American Ethnology, the United States research arm of the United States government set up in 1879 under John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran, the one-armed who had run the Colorado River, who had run the Colorado River, and then decided the more valuable territory was the memory of the dispossessing. The country was. Mooney would spend decades among the Cherokee and the Kiowa and the Ghost Dance faithful, and he had a rule that made him unusual for his time. He treated what an old person told him around a fire as data, not superstition, not quaint local colour. Evidence, to be recorded exactly and weighed later. Mooney had learned that discipline the hard way, in the field. He had walked into Cherokee towns in the North Carolina mountains and spent years earning the trust it took to be told the sacred formulas, the healing words that were not given to outsiders, and he had published them rather than let them die with the last people who knew them. He had gone among the Kiowa and reconstructed their calendar, the pictographic record they kept of the passing years. And in the 1890s he had done the dangerous and unpopular work of studying the Ghost Dance, the prophetic movement sweeping the western reservations in the years around the massacre at Wounded Knee, and he had insisted, against the mood of the country, that it was a religion and a grief and not a plot of savages. Everywhere he went he carried the same conviction, that the people the United States was writing off as relics were the living libraries of a history the United States did not otherwise have, and that a word taken down faithfully from an old man was worth more than a shelf of confident books written by men who had never bothered to ask. So when the Choctaw told him that their fathers had not built the mounds, that testimony went into the record, and it sat there, next to 100 other things the country did not want to hear, because at that exact moment the official science of the United States was busy proving something else entirely. It was proving, with surveys and skull measurements and thick illustrated volumes, that a lost and superior race had built the mounds. A race that was gone. A race that was not, under any circumstances, the ancestors of the Indians who were then being marched off the land those mounds stood on. That is the story. Not the mounds themselves, though we will walk through them, the ones larger than the cities of Europe at the same date, the ones aligned to the moon, the ones full of copper carried 1,000 miles by people with no wheel and no pack animal. The story is what a country decides to believe about the ground under its feet when believing the wrong thing is worth money. And the strange, quiet centre of it is that the Indians and the phantom race theorists were, in a narrow way, both telling a version of the truth. Something enormous had lived here, something continental, something that built in earth what other civilizations built in stone, and it was gone, or looked gone, by the time the argument started. The only question was who it had been. And the answer to that question was worth an entire section of the continent. To understand why a myth about dead architects could be worth that much, you have to start with what was actually here, and you have to start earlier than almost anyone expects. Go to a low ridge in northeastern Louisiana, in a place called Watson Brake, and you are standing on the oldest monumental architecture in the Americas. 11 mounds connected by ridges, arranged in an oval, built by people who had no pottery, no agriculture, no permanent town. Hunter-gatherers, and the earth was moved into that shape around 3,500 before the Common Era. That is older than the pyramids at Giza, older than Stonehenge in its finished form. It was built by people we are taught to think of as simple, mobile, small in number, and it required them to come back to the same spot across many generations and add basket load to basket load until an idea in someone's head became a permanent feature of the land. For a long time, archaeologists did not believe it could be that old, because the date did not fit the story of how civilizations are supposed to grow. The dating held. A little later, and not far away, comes poverty point. Around 1700 Common Era, again by people without farming. A society raised a set of concentric earthen ridges, arcs nested inside one another like frozen in the ground, facing a bayou, with mounds rising behind them. One of those mounds, the great bird-shaped Mound A, holds something like 238,000 cubic meters of fill. Modern study of its layers suggests it went up fast, in a matter of months, with no sign of the weathering you would expect if it had sat half-finished through a rainy season. That means organization. That means a large number of people fed and directed and working together on a single design, carrying earth in baskets on their backs, because there was no other way to carry it. And the stone found there, the tools and the little cooking objects and the ornaments, came from hundreds of miles in every direction. Chert from the Ouachita Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, soapstone from the Appalachian foothills. A trade map, drawn in the objects left behind, that already reached across half of what would become the United States more than 3,000 years ago, run by people with no writing to keep the accounts and no money to settle them. This is the first thing the lost race theory had to erase, because a theory that says Indians were incapable of this cannot survive the fact that the people doing it had no pyramidal empire behind them and no metal tools and no wheel and did it anyway, out of baskets and human backs, and an agreement that lasted longer than most nations do. Then, much later, something changes. Around the year 800 to 1000 of the Common Era, a crop finishes a long journey up from Mexico and settles into the river valleys of the mid-continent. Maize. Corn. And corn changes everything, because corn is a surplus you can store, and a stored surplus is the difference between a society that gathers and a society that can afford to build, to specialize, to feed people who do not grow food so that they can do something else instead. Within a few generations of dependable corn, the largest thing north of Mexico rises out of the floodplain across the river from where St. Louis stands today. We call it Cahokia, though that is the name of a later tribe who lived nearby and not the name of the people who built it, because we do not know what they called themselves. At its height, around the year 1100, Cahokia held something like 10 to 20,000 people in its core, with more in the farming settlements around it. That made it larger, at that moment, than London. Larger than most cities in Europe. A person standing in its central plaza would have seen a planned landscape, a grand rectangular plaza the size of dozens of football fields, ringed by earthen platforms, dominated by a single mound that we now call Monk's Mound, after some French Trappist monks who briefly gardened on it many centuries after it was abandoned. Monk's Mound is 100 feet tall. Its base covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It was built in stages, over decades, and it required something on the order of 14 to 16 million baskets of carried earth. Not quarried stone dragged on sledges. Earth, dug with wood and shell and stone, packed into baskets, carried up a growing hill on the backs and shoulders of people, layer engineered on layer with alternating soils to manage water and keep the whole mass from slumping. The engineers who built it understood drainage and load. They understood their material. And on top of it, 100 feet up, stood a great building, the residence of whoever ruled the city, looking down over the plaza and the smaller mounds and the 10,000 roofs. They laid out a ring of tall cedar posts, a great circle that tracked the sun through its year, that modern researchers nicknamed Woodhenge, so that the movement of the seasons could be read off the horizon by anyone who knew where to stand. They played a game called Chunky, rolling a carved stone disc and hurling spears at where it would stop, a game that spread across the whole region as the city's influence spread. And in one mound, the one we label Mound 72, archaeologists found something that tells you exactly how much power the city concentrated. A high-status man laid on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. And around and near him, the bodies of others, including rows of young women, and a pit of sacrificed retainers. Whatever Cahokia was, it was not an egalitarian village. It was a state, or close enough to one that the difference stops mattering. It had rank, ceremony, a mobilized labor force, an ideology powerful enough to move mountains of earth and to end lives in the service of a burial. Archaeologists who have studied how the city assembled describe it almost as an event rather than a slow growth, a sudden reorganization around the year 1050 that some of them call the Big Bang, when the scattered villages of the floodplain were pulled together and rebuilt on a single grand plan in a short span. That kind of transformation does not happen by accident. Somebody, or some council, or some vision, gathered thousands of people and convinced them to tear down what they had and raise a planned city of mounds around a leveled plaza. And the digging turns up the evidence of how they held it together. Vast feasting deposits, pits packed with the bones of thousands of deer and the residue of enormous quantities of food, the debris of gatherings where the labor was paid not in wages but in the oldest currency of all, a shared meal and a shared belief. The game of chunky spread outward from this place, along with the city's religion, its polished stone discs turning up at sites hundreds of miles away, a sport and a sacrament carried on the same currents that carried the copper and the shell. And then, within about 300 years, it emptied. The population thinned, the palisade went up in what looks like a response to trouble, the plaza fell quiet, and by the time any European stood on that ground, the great city was a set of grassy hills that local people could not fully account for. The collapse of Cahokia is one of the genuine open questions of North American archaeology. Drought, flood, deforestation of the surrounding hills for firewood and palisade timber, political failure, some combination. We do not have the full answer. But the important thing for our story is the timing. Cahokia was already gone as a living city before Columbus. Its abandonment was internal, its own long crisis. And that matters, because it means that by the time the mythmakers arrived, there was already a real ruin waiting to be misread. Cahokia was the largest, but it was not alone. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Down on the Black Warrior River in what is now Alabama, a city we call Moundville rose in the same era. 29 mounds around a planned plaza, a place that produced some of the most sophisticated art of the entire region. Engraved pottery and stone palettes carved with a hand and eye motif and with rattlesnakes twisted into knots. Images from a shared religious language that scholars once called the Southern cult and now call the Southeastern ceremonial complex. Over in Georgia, at Etowah, more platform mounds, and buried in one of them a pair of marble statues, a seated man and a kneeling woman, carved with a stillness and a confidence that would not look out of place in a museum of the ancient Mediterranean. Copper plates embossed with dancing falcon men. A whole iconography, repeated from Oklahoma to Florida, that says these were not isolated villages, but a connected world, with a common set of symbols and stories and elites who traded them back and forth. That shared religious language has a name now, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, and once you learn its grammar, you begin to see it everywhere across the Mississippian world. The same handful of images repeat from the Oklahoma plains to the Florida coast. A cross set inside a circle, standing for the sun and the sacred fire. A human eye held in the palm of an open hand, winged and antlered serpents. Falcon-costumed dancers with forked markings painted below the eye, warriors in the guise of the raptor. Engraved on shell, embossed on copper, incised into pottery, the motifs form a coherent iconography, a worked-out theology shared across 1,000 miles of the continent by people most of whom never met one another. It is the artistic signature of a single, vast cultural world, and for 2 full centuries the country that dug it up insisted that world had nothing to do with the Indians, who were its heirs. The clearest picture of how far that trade reached comes from earlier still, from the people we call the Hopewell, who flourished in the Ohio country roughly 2,000 years ago, centuries before Cahokia. The Hopewell did not build a single giant city. They built ceremonial earthworks, geometry laid out on the ground on a scale that is difficult to take in from any point a human can stand, perfect circles 1,000 feet across. Squares that enclose exactly the same area as the circles they connect to, and an octagon at a place called Newark in Ohio, joined to a circle by a passage, the whole figure covering enough ground to hold dozens of buildings, laid out with an accuracy that would be respectable with modern instruments, and was achieved with cords and stakes and sightlines. Two researchers, Ray Hively and Robert Horn, spent years at Newark trying to understand its orientation, and what they found is the kind of thing that should be more famous than it is. The octagon is aligned to the moon, not the sun, which is the easy target, the thing every farming people learns to track. The moon, whose rising and setting points wander through an 18-and-a-half-year cycle before returning, a cycle so long that no single person watching casually would ever notice it. To build an earthwork that frames the northernmost rising of the moon at the far end of that cycle, you have to have watched the horizon patiently across a span longer than a childhood, recorded it somehow, and then encoded it in earth on a scale of hundreds of feet. The Hopewell did that, in Ohio, around the time of the Roman Empire, and then they walked a religious road to that place carrying the dead and the offerings that came with them. And what came with them tells you the size of their world. In Hopewell burial mounds, archaeologists have found obsidian, volcanic glass, and it is not local. Chemical fingerprinting traces most of it to a single source, the Yellowstone country of Wyoming, more than a thousand miles away. They found copper hammered into breastplates and ornaments, ceremonial replicas of everyday tools, and that copper came from the Keweenaw Peninsula on Lake Superior, where ancient people had dug thousands of pits to work the pure native metal out of the rock. They found sheets of mica cut into the shapes of hands and claws and human profiles. Mica came from the southern Appalachians. They found the teeth of grizzly bears from the Rockies, shark teeth, and the shells of whelk and conch from the Gulf and the Atlantic coasts, silver from Ontario, meteoric iron. A single grave might hold the produce of a continent. Scholars gave this a bloodless name, the Hopewell interaction sphere, but sit with what it actually was. A network of exchange spanning from the Rockies to the Atlantic and from Lake Superior to the Gulf of Mexico, moving rare and valuable materials across thousands of miles of forest and river, without a wheel, without a draft animal, without a coin, without a written contract. Sustained for centuries by relationships and obligations and ceremonies we can only partly reconstruct. It was an economy, a real one, continental in scale, that priced value in shell and copper and the labor of the human back, and it was running while Rome was still standing. This is the buried civilization. Not a phantom, not a lost white race. This. Now hold that picture, the real one, next to the story the United States chose to tell instead, and watch what the story was for. By the early 1800s, American settlers pouring west across the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley kept running into the earthworks. Great geometric enclosures in the middle of the forest, mounds full of skeletons and copper, and pipes carved into the shapes of animals. And they asked the obvious question, who did this? The Indians they were in the process of removing did not, in most cases, claim to have built the biggest and oldest of these works. Some, like the Choctaw with their own mother mound, told origin stories that centered on a specific mound. But confronted with a giant abandoned earthwork in a river valley their people had entered only recently, many tribes gave the honest answer that Mooney would later record. We found them here. Older people built them. We do not know who. To a settler who wanted the land, that honest answer was a gift. Because if the current Indians had not built the mounds, then the mounds proved that a greater, more civilized people had once held this country, a people the Indians must have destroyed or displaced. And that changed the moral arithmetic of everything. The Indian was no longer the original owner of a homeland. The Indian was himself a conqueror, a latecomer, a savage who had wiped out the noble mound builders and squatted on their ruins. Taking the land from him was not theft. It was, if anything, a kind of justice, a reclaiming of a civilized inheritance from the race that had stolen it first. The myth turned dispossession into restoration. You can watch educated men build this scaffolding in real time. Caleb Atwater, a postmaster in Ohio, produced the first serious survey of the Ohio mounds in 1820, and though his measurements were useful, His conclusion was that the builders were Hindus from India who had passed through on their way to Mexico. William Henry Harrison, who would become president, wrote about the mounds as the work of a vanished civilized race overwhelmed by savages. And then there was Josiah Priest, whose book, American Antiquities, published in 1833, sold tens of thousands of copies, an enormous number for the time, by throwing every romantic possibility at the wall. The mound builders were the lost tribes of Israel. They were Egyptians. They were Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Vikings, Hindus, the Welsh followers of a medieval prince named Madoc, refugees from Atlantis. Anyone at all, so long as they were not the ancestors of the people currently standing on the land. And the timing of that book is not an accident. 3 years earlier, in 1830, the Congress of the United States Indian Removal Act. The Choctaw were the first to go. In September of 1830, at a place called Dancing Rabbit Creek in Mississippi, Choctaw leaders signed a treaty around 11 million acres of their homeland east of the Mississippi River in exchange for land in the west. It was the first of the great removal treaties, the template for what would be done to the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And the land the Choctaw signed away was Mound country. It was the rich black soil of the Mississippi and Alabama river bottoms, the same alluvial ground that had fed the corn that raised the platform mounds, and it was about to feed something else: cotton. The removal of the Choctaw and the tribes that followed them opened the black belt of the Deep South to the plantation economy, to cotton, and to the enslaved people forced to grow it, and that cotton would become the single most valuable export of the entire country. The mounds sat in the middle of the most economically important dispossession in American history. The theory that the current Indians were interlopers on a lost civilization's land was not an idle parlor speculation. It was a subsidy. It lowered the moral cost of the most profitable land transfer the nation would ever make. It is worth being precise about how much money sat on that table, because the numbers are what make the myth make sense. The soil the Choctaw and their neighbors were removed from was some of the most fertile cotton ground on earth, and cotton, in those exact decades, was becoming the engine of the entire American economy. Raw cotton grown on that southern land would go on to make up the largest single share of the country's exports, the collateral behind its banks, the raw material feeding the mills of both New England and England itself. An empire of cloth and credit was about to be built on the ground the mound builders had farmed, and the labor to raise it would be supplied by enslaved people sold south into the same expanding cotton frontier. So, the stakes of the mound question were never merely academic. Every acre freed of an ancient Indian claim could grow the most valuable crop in the world. A theory that dissolved that claim was, quite literally, worth its weight in cotton. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A French visitor happened to witness one small piece of the human bill for that transfer. Alexis de Tocqueville, travelling in America to study its democracy, stood at Memphis in the brutal winter of 1831 and watched a party of Choctaw cross the Mississippi River in the ice and cold, dispossessed, moving west. And he wrote that he would never forget the silence of it, the absence of weeping, the way whole families went into exile without complaint because complaint had no audience. Thousands of Choctaw died on that road and the ones that followed. The soil they left behind grew the cotton. And the intellectuals back east kept publishing books about the noble vanished race whose ruins the departing savages had never deserved to stand among. Not everyone fell for it. And here is one of the sharper ironies of the whole affair. The man who got it right first, decades before the professional scientists, was Thomas Jefferson, and he got it right by doing something almost no one else thought to do. He dug carefully and he looked. In the 1780s, on his own land near Monticello, Jefferson excavated a burial mound, but he did not just tunnel in looking for treasure, which was the ordinary method. He cut a trench through it and studied the layers, the way the earth and the bones were arranged in successive strata, one deposit of burials above another, separated by soil. This is stratigraphy, the foundational method of archaeology, and Jefferson was doing it a full century before it became standard practice in the field. From the layering, he reasoned about how the mound had grown, added to across many burial events over a long time, and he concluded that the local Indians, the ancestors of the people still in the region, had built it. He wrote it down in his notes on the state of Virginia. The evidence, read honestly out of the ground, pointed at the Indians. It always had. The lost race lived in books, not in dirt. But books are persuasive, and money is patient. And for most of the 1800s, the phantom race kept its hold on the public mind, propped up when necessary by outright fraud. Because the theory had a problem. The mounds themselves, dug into again and again, kept producing ordinary things. Pottery, pipes, copper, shell, bone, the goods of a Native American ceremonial world. What the theory needed, and never honestly found, was writing, an inscription. Anything that would prove the builders were literate Old World people rather than the ancestors of the tribes. And where a need like that meets a market, forgeries appear. In 1838, at the enormous Grave Creek in what is now West Virginia, the largest mound of its kind, a small inscribed stone disc turned up during a clumsy treasure excavation. The Grave Creek stone, covered in little characters that were promptly read by various enthusiasts as Phoenician, as ancient Celtic, as a half-dozen alphabets at once, which is exactly what you would expect from marks that mean nothing and can be forced to mean anything. It has almost certainly been a hoax from the day it appeared, and it has never stopped circulating. In 1860, near the great earthworks at Newark, a surveyor named David Wyrick produced a series of stones carrying inscriptions in Hebrew. One of them, the so-called Decalogue stone, bore a condensed version of the Ten Commandments in a strange late form of the Hebrew letters, wrapped around a robed figure. The Newark Holy Stones arrived at a very particular moment, when Americans were arguing bitterly about whether all humans shared one origin, an argument tangled up with slavery and race, and a Hebrew inscription in an Indian mound was ammunition. They were forgeries, and the details of the letters give them away, but they too refused to die. In the 1870s, in Iowa, a minister connected to the Davenport Academy of Sciences reported finding inscribed slate tablets in a local mound, tablets crowded with a jumble of alphabets, and a scene that seemed to show a cremation. The Davenport tablets became a local sensation and a point of civic pride, and it took decades and a determined scholar named Marshall McCusick to lay out the case that they had been planted, most likely as a hoax against the credulous Academy members, using an old slate roofing tile scratched with characters copied out of a dictionary and a Mormon pamphlet. The pattern is always the same. A mound that will not, on its own, produce a lost civilization is helped along by a stone that speaks the right language. And the appetite for those stones was not innocent curiosity. It was the same appetite that made Josiah Priest rich. People wanted the builders to be anyone but the Indians, and there were always men willing to sell them the proof. There had already been one serious attempt to survey the mound scientifically, and it is worth pausing on because of where it was published. In 1848, two Ohio men, Ephraim Square and Edwin Davis, produced a meticulous volume of surveys and measurements of the earthworks, hundreds of careful maps and cross-sections, the best documentation anyone had yet made of the great works. Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley became the very first publication the Smithsonian Volume 1 of the New National Storehouse the founding document of American Archaeology as a field, yet even Squire and Davis, for all their care with the ruler and the compass, still leaned toward the idea that the builders had been a vanished people distinct from the living tribes. The measurements were honest. The conclusion was the wish of the age. It would take another generation, and a government finally determined to get a real answer before the science caught up with what the dirt had been saying since Jefferson turned his trench. The federal government finally decided to settle the matter, and it settled it against its own convenience, which is the one detail in this whole story that gives you some faith in the eventual power of evidence. When Powell organized the Bureau of Ethnology in 1879, he set up a division of mound exploration and put a man named Cyrus Thomas in charge of it. Thomas, when he started, leaned toward the lost race view like almost everyone else. But he was given a real budget and a mandate to survey systematically, and over the next decade his teams examined thousands of mounds across the eastern half of the country, digging, recording, comparing, mapping. And the ground told Thomas the same thing it had told Jefferson 100 years before. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the Indians. The artifacts in them connected directly to the material culture of historic tribes. There was no break, no evidence of a separate vanished people, no writing, nothing that required an old world architect. In 1894, Thomas published his report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, a massive volume, and in it he declared the question closed. The mound builders were Native Americans. The lost race was a fiction. There is a small and telling irony tucked inside Thomas's own great debunking. One of his field agents, digging a mound at Back Creek in Tennessee, pulled out a small inscribed stone, and Thomas published it as an example of ancient writing that he read as a form of Cherokee. Much later, long after his death, a handful of enthusiasts would turn that very stone around and claim the inscription was actually ancient Hebrew, and the Bat Creek stone would go marching off into the parade of supposed proofs of an old world presence, cited against the very bureau that had unearthed it. The likeliest truth is that it too was a fraud, most probably salted into the dig by the agent to please his employer. Even the operation that killed the lost race theory had managed, without meaning to hand it one more relic to wave. That is how deep the appetite ran. It could contaminate the very evidence assembled to refute it. That should have been the end. In the scientific literature, more or less, it was. But a myth that useful does not simply evaporate because a government report told it to. It went underground and it waited, and it kept its forgeries in its pocket, and every generation or so it comes back up wearing new clothes because the underlying wish never went away. The wish to believe that the impressive things on this continent were built by someone other than the people who were removed from it. You can see the physical erasure that ran alongside the intellectual one. Consider St. Louis. Before it was a modern city, it was known, half admiringly, as the Mound City, because the Cahokia-related mound builders had left a cluster of mounds right where the town grew up. The greatest of them, the Big Mound, a long ridge-topped monument by the river, stood into the 1860s. And then, in 1869, it was simply carted away, levelled, its earth used as fill, and its site handed to a railroad. A monument older than most of Europe's cathedrals, dismantled into dirt to grade a rail line, and the human remains and artifacts inside it scattered with barely a record kept. Multiply that by thousands. Even Cahokia, the central mounds around Monk's Mound, were preserved, eventually, but scores of the outlying mounds that once stood across the floodplain were graded flat for farms and subdivisions and highways across the 19th and 20th centuries, hauled away as fill for the same roads that now carry tourists past what remains. A city that had held 20,000 people was reduced to a scatter of protected hills in a sea of pavement, and it counts as one of the lucky ones. The ones that were not saved are gone past any counting. Mounds ploughed flat for fields, mounds mined for road fill, mounds opened by Sunday treasure hunters. The great necropolis of the continent was dismantled a wheelbarrow at a time, and the same culture that dismantled it was publishing books about how tragic it was that the noble builders had vanished. Even the sites that survived were quietly repurposed in ways that show you exactly how little the buried civilization was thought to be worth. At Newark, the site of that astonishing moon-aligned octagon, the earthwork that tracks a cycle no casual eye can see, the Great Circle and the octagon were leased in the early 20th century to a country club. For more than 100 years, one of the most precise ancient astronomical monuments on the continent sat under a private golf course, its embankments serving as hazards on the fairway, accessible to the public only a few days a year. It took a lawsuit that ran all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, decided in 2022, to begin returning the Newark earthworks to public hands, and only in 2023 were they finally inscribed, together with the other great Hopewell works in Ohio, as a World Heritage Site, placed by the world's cultural authority alongside the pyramids and the cathedrals they had spent 2 centuries being denied comparison to. And out at Spiro, in eastern Oklahoma, you can see what happened when the market got to a mound before the archaeologists did. In the 1930s, a group of men leased the right to dig the Great Craig Mound at Spiro and formed what they called, without irony, a mining company. What they broke into was one of the richest intact deposits of Mississippian ceremonial art ever found, a hollow chamber packed with copper plates and engraved shell cups and textiles and pearls and carved pipes, a treasury that had survived intact for centuries. And they sold it, piece by piece, out of the back of the operation, to collectors and dealers, blasting and shoveling their way through irreplaceable material, until the state of Oklahoma passed an emergency antiquities law to stop them. By then, much of it was scattered across private collections and would never be fully recovered. The men who did it were sometimes called, in the newspapers of the day, with a strange admiration, the ones who had found the King Tut of the Arkansas River. The comparison was apt in a way the writers did not intend. Here was a royal tomb of a genuine civilization, and the country's instinct was to auction it. Now come back to the Choctaw and to what they actually said, because the honest version of their testimony is more interesting than either the myth or the simple rebuttal to it. The Choctaw did not, in fact, deny all connection to the Mounds. At the very heart of their own tradition stands one, Nani Waya, a great earthen platform in what is now Winston County, Mississippi, near the headwaters of the Pearl River, the Mother Mound. The Choctaw carried two related stories about it, and they did not treat them as contradictory. In one, the emergence story, the people came up out of the earth at Naniwaya, crawling out of the ground or out of a cave in the mound's flank, and dried themselves in the sun on its slopes before spreading out into the country. The mound was the birthplace, the navel, the point where the people entered the world. In the other, the migration story, the Choctaw and their brother people, the Chickasaw, came from far to the west, led on a long journey by two brothers, Choctaw and Chickasaw, who each night planted a sacred leaning pole in the ground, a fabusa, and read the direction of travel from the way it leaned in the morning. And when at last they reached the place where the pole stood straight up and did not lean, they knew they had arrived at the center of the land, and there stood Naniwaya, and there they stayed. Read those two stories together and something clicks into place. This is a people who remembered being born from a mound and remembered migrating to a mound, who held the earthwork as the fixed sacred center of their existence. They did not build the oldest of the great works, the Poverty Points and the Watson Breaks that predated their arrival by thousands of years, and they said so plainly, and that honesty is exactly why the record is trustworthy. But they were part of the same long earth-building world, keepers of a mound that anchored their entire cosmology. When the old man told Mooney his fathers had found the great mounds already standing, he was not disowning them, he was distinguishing. Those, over there, in the abandoned valleys, we did not raise. This one, here, is ours, and it is the middle of the world. The distinction is the whole point, and it is the thing the lost race theory could not allow, because the theory needed the Indians to be strangers to all the mounds equally. The truth is stranger and sadder. The builders and the current inhabitants were often the same people, or closely related peoples, separated not by race but by catastrophe. Because there was a catastrophe, and it is the missing piece that makes the honest picture cohere. In 1539, a Spanish expedition under Hernando de Soto landed in Florida and spent the next several years cutting a violent through the southeast, and the men who kept its chronicles described something no later European would ever see. They described the mound-building civilization while it was still alive. They walked into towns built around flat-topped platform mounds with the chief's house and the temple on top, exactly the arrangement archaeologists would later dig out of the ground and struggle to interpret. They met powerful chiefs carried on litters, rulers of provinces with names like Kusa and Kofitacheki, and at Kofitacheki they were received by a woman, a paramount chiefess whom the chroniclers called the Lady of Kofitacheki, who came out to meet them across a river and gave them pearls from the temple mounds of her ancestors. De Soto's men saw the storehouses, the ranked society, the sacred structures on the summits. They saw the platform mounds in use, doing exactly the job the archaeology says they did. They also brought the thing that ended it. Not their swords, though the swords did plenty at places like Mobila, where thousands died in a single day's battle against the Choctaw people's ancestors and their allies. What ended the civilization was invisible. Old world diseases, smallpox and measles and the rest, against which the people of the Americas had no inherited defense, moving faster than the Spanish themselves through the dense trade networks that connected the chiefdoms. In the century between De Soto and the next serious European penetration of the interior, the population of the southeast appears to have collapsed by an enormous fraction. Whole provinces emptied. There is a region of the central Mississippi Valley that archaeologists have taken to calling the vacant quarter, a great swath of the mid-continent that had been thickly settled with mound towns and that appears to have been largely abandoned in the generations around and after first contact, emptied out and surrendered to the forest before most Europeans ever laid eyes on it. The people did not simply dissolve into the air. They died, or fled, or folded into other groups, and the towns they left behind stood silent long enough that the memory of them frayed and broke. When De Soto's chroniclers described the fury of the fighting at Mabila, the fortified town where the ancestors of the Choctaw and their allies nearly destroyed the whole Spanish expedition in a single day of battle before being overwhelmed by steel and horses, they were describing a society still whole enough to field an army and defend its walls. Within a lifetime or two, that society was a fraction of itself, and the survivors were rebuilding a new world out of the pieces of the old one. The great platform mound towns fell silent. The survivors regrouped, coalesced into new, smaller societies, and among those new configurations were the tribes the English and French would eventually meet, including the historic Choctaw, who assembled in part out of the shattered remnants of that older world. So, when Anglo-American settlers arrived in the 1700s and 1800s and found abandoned mounds in the forest and Indians who could not always account for them, they were not looking at a mystery. They were looking at the aftermath of a demographic catastrophe they themselves had helped set in motion 2 centuries earlier, without ever seeing what it destroyed. The mounds were abandoned because their builders had died in numbers hard to imagine, and the memory of who built which mound had been shredded along with the population that carried it. The continuity was broken not by a phantom conquering race, but by a plague. And the settlers took the broken continuity as proof of a lost race, when it was really proof of a lost people. The same people, in the end, just fewer of them, and stripped of the institutions that had held the knowledge. This is why the honest reading of the Choctaw testimony matters so much. They were telling the truth. Their fathers, meaning the specific migrating people who became the Choctaw, genuinely had not built the oldest works and did not remember who had, because the chain of memory had been cut by the collapse. And they were also the inheritors and relatives of the builders, keepers of their own mound, part of the same earth-shaping tradition that ran back through Cahokia and Hopewell to Poverty Point and Watson Break. Both halves of what the old man told Mooney were correct. The country's mistake, the profitable mistake, was to take the first half and throw away the second. Think for a moment about the sheer economic scale of what was lost and then denied. This was a civilization, or a long succession of civilizations, that ran a continental exchange network for over 3,000 years. It supported cities the size of European capitals on stored corn. It built astronomical instruments out of earth, precise to the standards of the cultures we do put in the textbooks. It organized labor on a scale that raised a 100-foot mountain by hand, basket by basket, without coercion that left any trace of chains, apparently through some combination of belief and obligation and feasting that we still do not fully understand. It priced value, extended credit through gift and reciprocity, specialized its labor, and concentrated wealth in ranked elites, all without writing, without the wheel, without working metal tools, and without a single draft animal. And the country that inherited the land those people built on spent the better part of a century insisting they had never existed, because admitting they existed was expensive. It would have meant admitting that the people being removed had a deep and rightful claim to a homeland with an ancient and sophisticated history. It was cheaper to believe in ghosts, cheaper to sell the octagon to a golf course, and the big mound to a railroad, and the Spiro treasures to collectors. Cheaper to fill the pages with lost tribes of Israel and refugees from Atlantis than to write, plainly, that the ancestors of the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the peoples of Cahokia had built one of the great earth-moving civilizations of the ancient world, and that it had been taken from them twice, first by disease and then by law. James Mooney died in 1921, having spent his life writing down what people told him, at a time when the writing down was itself a small act of resistance against the official story. The Bureau's own Cyrus Thomas had already broken the lost race theory in the scientific record, but the myth outlived them both, because it was never really about archaeology. It was about who deserved the land. And on that question, the Mounds have always given the same answer. Whether read out of Jefferson's careful trench, or Thomas's thousands of surveys, or the plain words of an old Choctaw man who saw no reason to lie about which hills his fathers had raised and which they had merely found. There is a coda to the Nani Waya story, and it is the kind of ending the myth makers never imagined. The Choctaw who remained in Mississippi after removal, the ones who hid in the swamps and the hollows and refused to leave, became the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, recognized by the federal government in the 20th century, still living within a short drive of their mother Mound. Nani Waya passed into the hands of the state of Mississippi and become a state park, a picnic ground with a sacred mound in it, owned by the government that had signed the removal treaty. And in 2008, after long effort, the state of Mississippi gave it back. Nani Waya was returned to the Choctaw, restored to the people whose origin it was, and the tribe declared a holiday to mark the center of the world, handed back to the people who were born from it. The mounds are still there. Monk's Mound still rises 100 feet over the Illinois floodplain, and you can climb the modern staircase to the top and stand where the ruler of a city larger than London once stood, and look out over the highway and the strip malls that cover what was the Grand Plaza, and feel how completely a civilization can be paved over and forgotten by the one that follows. Poverty Point is a quiet field in Louisiana that most Americans have never heard of, though it carries the same World Heritage designation as Stonehenge. The Newark octagon still catches the moon at the far end of its long cycle. The earth remembers the shape it was given. It is only the story that got lost, and the story got lost because someone found it profitable to lose it. So, the next time you drive past a low grassy hill in a river valley in the eastern half of this country, the kind of hill a farmer plows around without a second thought, consider that you may be looking at the last standing architecture of a civilization that traded across a continent for 3,000 years and was talked out of existence in about one. Consider that the people who could have told you who built it were marched away from it at gunpoint while intellectuals explained that they never could have. And consider what an old man told a careful listener a long time ago, that his fathers had found some of these already standing and had raised others with their own hands, and that both of those things were true, and that the only people who ever needed them not to be true were the ones who wanted the ground. The record survived anyway. It survived in Jefferson's careful trench and in Thomas's thousands of surveys, in a mother mound handed back to the Choctaw in the 21st century. It survived, most of all, because a man named Mooney sat in a cabin and wrote down what an old man told him instead of what the country wanted to be told, and because the old man, knowing perfectly well the difference between the hills his people had raised and the hills they had merely found, saw no reason to lie about either. The buried civilization was here. It was indigenous. It ran an economy across a continent for longer than the United States has so far existed, and it was talked into a phantom because the phantom paid better. All of that is in the ground, and in the record, waiting for anyone willing to go and read it. Make of that what you will.